Hello, this is Dorie Clark. We're here for our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And our guest this week is Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She is the former president of StubHub. She's also the author of the new book, Choose Possibility. And the subtitle, we can all use a little more of this, How to Master Risk and Thrive. We're going to be talking today with her about how to ensure that we are taking better risks, smarter risks in our career in order to create the lives that we want. Sukhinder, so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to join you on LinkedIn.
Excellent. And for those of you who are tuning in live, please feel free to type into the chat box and let us know who you are and where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to hear your questions for Sukhinder. So, Sukhinder, the first question that I have for you. So choosing possibility, that sounds like something that just about everyone can get behind. But of course, we all know from experience that a lot of people feel conflicted. They feel paralyzed. You talk about a problem that you say in many ways may be at the root of all of this, the myth of the single choice. Can you explain what this is and why it's so pernicious?
Sure. Well, I think we can all identify with feeling paralyzed, right? By one choice, big or small. Sometimes we're paralyzed even from taking the smallest action. And what I call the myth of the single choice is this myth we all carry in our heads that we are one choice away from glorious success or abject failure. That there is one choice that is the make or break decision in our careers, in our personal lives. But I often say to people, what if I told you that one choice does not make success or failure? What if I told you that, every time you make a big choice, between you and the big reward you imagine is probably 10, 20, 100, 1,000 more choices to be made? You really sort of learn when you back up that this myth of the single choice puts so much pressure on a single choice, and like choosing wisely. And I always say to people, if you only count on a single choice, I think that might be the riskiest move you make in your career. If, however, you embrace risk taking as a process of continually choosing, getting the result, success or failure from that mini outcome, choosing again, even a large choice is followed by small choices to make it the reality you want happen. Once you release yourself from this idea that one mighty choice is the answer, and free yourself to say like, hey, I probably have 100 or 1,000 choices to make between me and, where I want to end up. You free yourself to make that first choice because you don't put so much weight on it. And you realize you always have many more moves than you think between you and the finish line.
That's such an important point. We're here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's the author of the new book, Choose Possibility. You can learn more about it at choosepossibility.com. And we're here talking about how to thrive through failure. We also want to say hi to some of the great friends tuning in from around the world to join our conversation. Helene is here from New York, Cheryl from Minneapolis, St. Paul, Kara from Ontario. We've got a LinkedIn user from Nairobi, Anita from beautiful Half Moon Bay, George from Rodriguez Island. We have New Jersey in the house, Ulf from Vienna, Messeret is joining us, Daniel from Sao Paulo, Michaela from Greenville, South Carolina, Priscilla from Mexico, Mandla from South Africa, Douglas from Miami, Vani from France, and many more. We're so glad to have you here. Please let us know who you are, where you're tuning in from, and your questions for Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, author of Choose Possibility. Now, Sukhinder, I think you make a great point. Obviously, if we put too much weight on anything, we're gonna just be hamstrung and feel like the weight of it is so enormous we can't do anything about it. A lot of people, though, we're coming out of 2 years of the pandemic, a time when a lot of people were disrupted. Many people may have lost their jobs or had other disruptions. They may feel at this moment like things are just a little dicier, that it might be harder to take some kind of a chance. On the other hand, we have the Great Resignation going on. So I feel like there's these cross currents around people's relationships to risk. What do you see out there?
I'll tell you what I make of it. And in some ways, if you put it all together, it makes a weird kind of sense. So let me give you an example. When I was at StubHub, I was brought in to be the CEO and help reinvigorate the sort of entrepreneurial energy of a company that had been bought and owned by eBay for 10 years. So I was brought in by eBay's leadership team and said, like, look, like we have this amazing asset, but it's not growing as fast as it should be. So for 2 years as a CEO, before the pandemic, I was working very hard to train my team to have agility. Like, hey, stop worrying about being perfect. Let's like take more shots on goal in terms of new services. Let's more rapidly respond. Let's set goals quarter by quarter rather than have them be static year by year. And I think I was making progress, right? Like, I think I was training people to be more agile. By the way, we were in a pretty relatively safe environment, owned by a big company. Yes, growth was low, but nobody's worried about their paycheck, let alone survival. We then sell the company, and the company sells on February 13th, 2020. And on March 13th, 2020, we lose virtually all of our revenue. StubHub was a $5 billion ticketing platform. And so I go from selling it for a record sum to another ticketer, by the way, to on March 13th, still being the CEO, thinking I'm going to transition out and, we'll leave things in good standing as I've now sold the company, only to find that I'm still holding the bag along with my employees when we lose 99% of our revenues. And by the way, we're owned by somebody who also just lost 99% of theirs. And in the next 2 weeks, in the next 3 months, what I saw from my team is more agility than I could ever have imagined. So let's think about that, right? In relatively safe circumstances, hard to be agile. Yet when faced with true harm, I mean like survival level harm, like, will this brand exist? Like, what do we need to do to make sure that, the company doesn't, disappear on our watch, that there is a StubHub, to still serve fans 2 years hence. We did furloughing. We made some just very critical and very painful decisions around cash management versus offering refunds versus offering credits on the site. Like, we pivoted the entire business to just focus on survival. And by the way, I saw a team act with a kind of agility that I'm not sure they thought they had. By the way, it was agility in the face of like true extraordinary harm, right? So what does that tell us about COVID? On the one hand, it tells us that we sometimes are afraid to act when things are safe because we imagine all of these terrible outcomes that might happen. And then comes the day where we are confronted by a truly terrible outcome. And I think many people know, like there's a saying, never waste a good crisis, that people act with more agility and learn their resilience in crisis in a way that you would hope would happen when things are safe, right? That's the best time to take risk, yet we don't. So how does this all tie together? Well, we come to the Great Resignation. My belief is that two things are going on for people. Number one, people learned their agility, they learned their resilience, and they also started questioning the choices they would be free to make in a new world of work, right? So there's this freeing aspect for new possibilities that people probably never contemplated were even possible. And then they learned it was possible through their companies. They learned that they had more agility. And so I think I call it the Great Rethink, or actually I shouldn't say I call it that. Somebody told that phrase to me, and I like it even better than the Great Resignation. It helps people sort of reimagine possibilities. So that's one end of the spectrum. Now, to your point, the other end of the spectrum is like, hey, that's a lot of change. Like, I totally get it when people are like, wait, do I have to change again? Like, I've had a lot of change. And the most important thing, actually, I think that comes out of COVID is like, yes, you have had a lot of change. You learn something about yourself. I'm not saying do change for change's sake. I'm basically saying you learn something important about yourself. Let's not lose that lesson, right? And whether you say in this moment, guess what? I've had a lot of change. I just would love to sit silent for a moment. That's okay. The world continues to be unstable in new ways, right? But mostly it teaches us about our own kind of ability to make choices beyond the restrictions that we often sort of think are put upon us, especially when times are good. So I think that's the way I reconcile these two belief systems and what's happening right now.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. We're here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's the author of the book Choose Possibility. You can learn more at choosepossibility.com. We want to take a moment to say hi to the great folks who are tuning in from all around the world. Daniel is watching from the banks of the Bighorn River in Montana. I like that. Selena is here from Louisiana. Abdullahi is from Nigeria. Denise from Florida. Balakumar is in India. We have Arnstein from somewhere that seems Scandinavian. We have Ahmed from Egypt, Raul from Miami, Trent from Silver Spring, Robert from Berlin, Uchechi from Lagos. We have our friend Adnan from Turkey. We've got Muhammad in the house, and we are so glad to have all of you. We're looking for your questions for Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. Feel free to type them into the chat box. And Sukhinder, one of the things that I'm curious about, your book is called Choose Possibility. It sounds like an encouraging statement for people, but it's actually more than that. You have laid out a specific process about
Mhm.
how one chooses possibility. This is not just rah rah. You actually have a kind of formula that people can plug into to learn how to do that. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that we have two opposing things going on, right? We're people who are paralyzed, and then this world where the what we see and celebrate in the world is these like big, bold risk takers, like Jeff Bezos, or Elon Musk, sending someone to Mars, let alone the moon. And the problem with both of these is like the reality is somewhere in between, right? The reality is paralysis is not safe. If you just stayed still, there's lots of suggestion data to suggest that your skills will decline, that they'll become less relevant. So like staying still, not the answer to personal growth. You know that. But if somebody says just take risk, just take risk. I mean, and your model for risk taking is this like, the celebration of like one mighty choice, when in fact what we don't celebrate is the 1,000 choices that those people made beforehand, right? We sort of extract it, that you're caught in this like willy-nilly place. So the book is meant to give you a structure around risk taking. Like, of course, we all want to take more risk, but we want to be smart risk takers, right? Like I mean, again, like taking risk foolishly, like taking one shot and just like out of luck, like that to me is not about being a smart risk taker. So the framework I lay out in the books is like, hey, how do you think about little choices and big choices? And first of all, I think framework number one is, you think you don't have risk to take today? You think the only risk is small or mighty? I would challenge that belief system. I'd say that most people every day can take risks to learn, to discover, to achieve an ambition, or to avoid harm. Those are all choices you could make today. So if you thought about anything with an uncertain outcome as a little risk, the first thing to do is sort of embrace a framework where you practice a little risk taking every day. And people were like, well, what's the value of that? I'm like, well, first of all, at individual choice levels, like if you started to basically say, gosh, if I take only a big risk to get a big return, I would tell you that the framework suggests that at a single bet level, it's not linear. You might have a little risk that leads to an outside reward. You might have a little risk that leads to a little failure. You might have a little risk that leads to a little success. You might take a little risk that leads to absolutely nothing other than learning. But those are all outcomes, right? So training ourselves to be in this choice making, read the outcome, choice making, read the outcome when things are little helps inure us to failure. And then guess what? Like if I said to you, like, hey, there are all these ways to be a risk taker. So you can just take no risk and then take one big risk, or you can become a better risk taker by taking little risks every day. It's sort of like a trading philosophy. I'm like, okay, do you think you're going to get rich on making one like incredible trade during your lifetime? The best traders are portfolio traders. They like literally it's about the frequency of their bets, some small, some big, and becoming more calculated over time as you see the results. But never expecting that like any single stock trade may not fail, right? So that's the kind of framework I lay out in the book. And then there's a different framework for how to make kind of what I call bigger choices, like literally, like life-changing choices. Of course, we all come upon bigger choices in our lifetime. And how do you even create a smart framework for that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. We're here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's the author of the new book, Choose Possibility. If you're enjoying this conversation, please hit the like and share button so your friends can benefit. And we would be curious. We'd love to hear, what risks have you taken? What choices have you made? Type it into the chat box and let us all learn from it. Sukhinder, I'm curious, when people think about taking risks, especially professional risks, to your point, oftentimes that connotes something really large. The example is like, oh, well, I quit my job or something like that. When you talk about taking little risk, what are some examples? If somebody's like, okay, I'm bought in, I'm willing to take little risks. What are some little risks that people could take today, just as examples?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, most of the opportunity we have for impact in our lives is not like 3 years out. It's today, right? It's about getting into that virtuous cycle of choice making, little reward. So here's an example of a risk that I think people should take more of at work: the risk of truth telling, right? Or the risk of authorship. Let's go through both of those. The risk of truth telling. You're in a meeting, you stay silent. Everybody knows this. You likely have a thought about what's going on. You might have a question. You might have an observation. You might have an original idea, right? Those are all examples of like, opportunities. An original idea is an opportunity for authorship. An observation or concern is an opportunity for truth telling. Yet you stay silent. All right. Why do you stay silent? Because the risk you worry about is ego risk, potentially, that you'll look stupid. But let's think about the upside of making that happen. You speak a concern, it gets batted away. Okay, well, you learn something, or it gets acknowledged and you get an answer to your question. You share an observation, you share an original thought, you advance the thinking of the whole room. So, like, most of the time, the risks that keep us from having impact today at work are ego driven. By the way, there's a completely other topic around whether you feel safe at work and how safety and risk are related at work, and I'm happy to go into that. But by and large, for the average person who's going into work every day and presuming they are in a place where they think that their values generally fit and they're with people they like, the things that hold us back from taking a risk to have a little bit more impact today, to help unlock, more success for ourselves, our colleagues, what have you, are often driven by ego risk. Like, what if I look stupid? And I'm like, but what if you advance the conversation? Even if you don't get the response you want, have you advanced, the chances for success for the whole room? The chances are probably yes. That's an example of a little risk everybody could take today. I often hear people say, like, well, another risk I think that's an obvious one is people are like, well, I'm unhappy in my job, so should I quit? I'm like, okay, so that's a big risk to take. That's a big choice. But between now and there's a whole bunch of questions you should be asking, not just of yourself, but even your boss. So if you're unhappy, there is a risk to go in, but there's also an opportunity to go in and have a conversation with your boss and basically say, hey, I'm not feeling great. It could be this, it could be this. These are the things I kind of am feeling myself that I could be doing better. Here's some of the things that are going on that I'm struggling with. What do you think? Like, between you and like quitting your job today is like 1,000 choices to figure out if you could make the situation better. Even a conversation is a choice.
That's such a great point. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. We're here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, author of Choose Possibility. You can learn more and get her book at choosepossibility.com. If you're enjoying this conversation, we're here every Thursday for Newsweek. It's our LinkedIn Live series, Better, and you can go to dorieclark.com, sign up, get a free assessment, and you will get reminders about these great conversations so that you never have to miss one. We also want to say hi to great friends who are tuning in here. We have Elo from DC. We have Mary from Boston. We have Nathaniel from Austin, Texas. Zulima from Mexico. Pamela's here from New York. We have lots of folks who are tuning in and asking great questions. But one that I thought is especially interesting, and I think we've all been there at one time or another. Denise is curious, Sukhinder. She wants to know, what do you do about somebody who just feels overwhelmed with all of the choices? There's a million things I could do.
Yeah.
How do I know where to start or what's the right one? What do you do in that situation?
Yeah. By the way, as we know, this like too much choice is a problem in of itself, right? So we don't have time to go through all of it today, but I have a few different suggestions, and I lay them out in more detail in the book. But some of the important ones. Number one, there is something to choice maximization before choosing. Like, that's called being a smart risk taker, right? You want to like maximize all the available choices, list them. But it starts with something as simple as, believe it or not, identifying your goal set for the next 3 to 5 years. Not more than that, not less than that. But in a big choice, it's often like, what is it you want to achieve? Right. And then stack ranking and rating your choices against, what you want to achieve, rating them against, your strengths and weaknesses, how they attune to who you are, rating the different choices against, who you might be working with, rating the different choices around the probabilities of success in the environment. These are all things, but actually I put them all in a spreadsheet, believe it or not. And I literally force myself to apply numbers to each choice. Okay. So that's how I deal with, having too many choices, because I know when I apply a number and a rating to every choice against these dimensions, I can start to organize them in my head. The second most important thing, I always say, like, set a time frame to make a choice, because to your point, you could live in choice maximization forever and never move. So what we all know is important is, like, you need to set a deadline for a choice. And if you can't make what I call people the maximum viable choice, you can't just pick one from the menu, make the minimum viable choice, which is, what is the smallest incremental move you could make today towards the entire choice set, as you reveal information. But to be honest, mostly what I do to reduce choice sets is I rate, I rate, like, literally numerize them. Number 2, I set a time frame for taking an action. And number 3, I commit myself to what I call the minimum viable action. I'm going to take at least one minor move even if that minor move is just keeping on unfolding the options, but I have to take a directional move, some kind of action. Because people are overwhelmed by too much choice, ironically. So you have to find a way to organize it, but really set a time limit on your decision making frameworks.
Time limits are a really important point. That's great. We're here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's the author of the new book, Choose Possibility. And Sukhinder, a great question came in, a very philosophical question from our friend Douglas in Miami. Douglas wants to know, how do I know if I'm taking a risk as opposed to being reckless, since I'll never have all the information that I need? In a world of incomplete information, how do we actually make sense and feel comfortable pulling the trigger?
Well, first of all, Doug, I can almost guarantee you're not going to be reckless by asking that question. Like, what reckless risk taking to some degree looks like, think about creating that spreadsheet I talked about and saying you want to rate it against these dimensions and not even having the information available to rate it. So, that to me is an example of being reckless. You put it down and I say, okay, how does it match against your goals? How does it match? How does this choice match against your strengths and passions? And values? How does this choice, maximize working with smart people? How does this choice, sit in the macro context? Are you entering something with a headwind situation or tailwinds, right? If you can't answer those four basic questions, chances are you're being reckless. Like, you want to choose without the information, knock yourself out. But if you set a time frame for yourself to go fill in the blanks against any known parameters, you will have enough information to broadly compare and make a choice. And as we know, no choice is perfect. We often think that, right? We think if we have perfect information, we'll make the perfect choice. Not true. You can have completely perfect information and still make a choice that doesn't work out. That's why it's called risk. Like, you don't know what the variables you anticipate and how they turn out in reality. The most you can do is anticipate, and then anticipate how you would respond if something changes. You can do that too. So I would say to you, chances are if you ask that question, you're never going to be reckless. But I think the way to hold yourself honest is really, like I said, to create that literally spreadsheet, list your choices. You would be shocked by how many choices I rate and carry on my iPhone. But just be able to say, what are my criteria, and fill in the blanks on your criteria. That's the best it's ever going to be. But I think recklessness looks like not getting all the information. Recklessness looks like not maximizing your choices. So somebody says to you, hey, Dorie, go here. And you're like, oh, I think I'm going to go there. And I'm like, okay, well, can you step back and tell me what your goals are? Okay, Dorie, you're going to go there. Does that serve the goal you have? Did you stop to think about your goal? Hey, Dorie, what are 3 other ways you might get to that goal? Just say to the person who's pressing you for a decision, hey, can you give me a week? And go into rapid diligence on 2 or 3 other choices that could get you to the same place. So to me, those are the ways to avoid being reckless.
So good. And I assume, to your point, that there are some choices that it's not worth doing that level of research. If I say, yeah, I'm here teaching at Columbia today in New York, and if I said to someone, where should I go for food afterwards? And they say, oh, go to this place. That's probably not where I'm going to be rank ordering them, correct?
You're right. Unless you want to drive yourself crazy on risk taking. I always say to people, little risk taking, what you're really doing at any moment in your head is judging the upside versus the downside. And on little risk, I would just say most people overbloat the downside, where I would say, play for the upside. Most of the low risk we take every day upside. And if you fail, guess what? All you're doing is training your risk muscle. So most little risks are not worth it. Certainly on big choices, my spreadsheets compete with the best of them.
Oh, that's fantastic. And just to your point, Sukhinder, you were talking earlier about the myth of the single choice, and Cheryl wants to back that up. She says, I had assumed that a project I was leading was my only option, but I was able to switch to one that was a better fit the same day I presented that alternative to my manager.
Yeah, you're absolutely, this is what I mean, right? We tend to think very binary. This is one of my kind of, breakthrough words when I was writing the book. And when I speak about it, we think in black and white terms. It's this or it's that. But if you thought about choices incrementally, you would find that there are a lot more variables and a lot more incremental choices between this choice and that choice. It's not often this or that. It's often this, or maybe this, or maybe this, or maybe this derivative, or maybe this derivative. And somewhere in those derivatives may lie your happiness, right? These are all the little risks before you're like, hey, I'm ready to jump off a cliff. By the way, I've jumped off a cliff plenty in my career, and I can tell you that many of those bigger choices have been some of the most fulfilling. Some haven't worked, right? So I'm not advocating only small choices. There's a lot to be said for making nonlinear change. Mostly I'm advocating for thinking about, your infinite set of choices as opposed to presuming you have only one.
Excellent point. We're here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's the author of the book Choose Possibility. You can learn more about it at choosepossibility.com. And Sukhinder, a question came in from Adora, and she wanted to know, I'll just flash it momentarily here. She was curious about gender implications when it comes to making choices and feeling comfortable about choices and levels of risk. I'd love for you to comment on that. And perhaps you can also tie it in. You are the founder of an organization called the Board List. And one of its goals is increasing the representation of women on private company boards. And so I would love to hear how these things tie in, and also any updates that you have about
Sure,
the Board
happy
List
to
and its work.
happy to hit all of it. So first of all, I think just on gender, if you think about the average workplace, people are like, hey, Sukhinder, how can it be that, like, one of the theses in the book is possibility and choice is abundant, as you can probably hear from my language, right? But how does bias exist? And I'd say, well, just because possibility is abundant, it doesn't mean it's evenly distributed, right? And we would all agree that the lack of level playing field may mean that I have more choices than you have, right? But not by virtue of my actions or lack of actions or desire to take risk or not, but by virtue of an environment that sort of presents more possibilities to some. And quite frankly, when others choose to take risk, they are penalized for it. Classic example being women being aggressive. You're like, hey, I used my voice, and guess what? Due to gender bias, when I use my voice, it's not seen as having upside. It actually produces downside. So I think it is possible to say the world is abundant with possibility, yet the way in which, if we offer ourselves up to the world and we are the only or the other, there is a real risk that the way it's received in certain environments, where you don't have a values match, where your worldview of what is just and fair is the same as your company's, that you might say, hey, I'm not in an environment where I feel like that can be received. So that's one point of view on risk. Now, let me come to what the research says. So independent of whether or not you think you're in a level playing field or not, all the analyses, not all, the majority of analyses find that on 14 of 16 different dimensions, women take less risk than men. So by its very nature, less shots on goal. Okay. So if you believe that part of mastering your career is going to be a great risk taker in order to unlock its cumulative rewards over many choices, well, if you make less choices and take less risk, you're unlikely to get the same level of rewards over the long haul. So that already presents an issue. And that's independent of whether or not you think you're in a non-level playing field. Presuming you're in a level playing field, women still take less risk than men. That's what the data suggests. Now, there is some depressing stuff in those studies, and there's something that's hopeful. The depressing pieces here are that women and girls are more cautious and take less risks than they should, including small risks. Men and boys are more indiscriminate in their risk taking and take risks even when they shouldn't. Okay, so there's the shots on goal. Women are also less likely to take risks in the case of confirming bias, which is when it's believed that women are less capable of taking risk, they may act in concert with that bias. This is like the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like when women are told they're less capable, then they may do less well on test scores, as an example. There's lots of research that talks about this kind of bias. So the last thing we want to do is tell, women like, hey, you're less capable of taking risk and create a confirmatory bias right in our own systems. The hopeful thing is, and this is the thing for us to think about as managers before, I know we're going to wrap up here. The hopeful thing is that both men and women will take risks under two circumstances. Number one, where they believe that the outcome is important to them. So how valuable is the thing you're seeking? You might take more risk. Number two, where they believe they will be successful. So people are more likely to take risks, right? Again, in cases where they think they'll be successful. So our opportunity at work, and if we are managing people who may be more disposed to taking less risk, is to offer up opportunities for them to feel safe to take risk without being presumptive that they're not capable, without being condescending or patronizing or confirming that bias. But it means we may need to offer up more chances and opportunities to take risk and feel safe for certain parts of the population that we're managing. So that's how I think about it all. Now, the board list is trying to do one thing and one thing only, which is, hey, if you believe the world has an unequal playing field when it comes to access to opportunity, the board list just seeks to equalize access to opportunity in the boardroom by saying, hey, I'm going to surface all of the amazing talent that's out there so it can be discovered more easily. So we can kill one of those kind of myths that there are not enough talented executives or board members, who are women or represent other underrepresented groups. So the board list is trying to sort of equalize the playing field, and how we're doing, like, we're a little startup trying to do big things. And I would say every year, more and more need for our services, but also progress. You definitely see in the boardroom that as new board seats open up at the macro level, women and underrepresented minorities are actually acquiring those seats at a pretty unprecedented rate.
That is fantastic. We have been here with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. She's the author of the book Choose Possibility. If you want to learn more, check out her book, pick up a copy, go to choosepossibility.com. We want to thank everyone for tuning in this week. We'll be back next Thursday, same time, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 5 o'clock in London. Sukhinder, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Take care, everyone, and see you next week.